For myself, it was always clear I wanted to build a company. That was the entire strategy and plan behind even coming to the US. I knew that would be a great jumping board for me to meet the right people and actually get into an environment where I can start a company. The state of mental health is really there being a huge gap between demand and supply. There's so many people who struggle with their mental health but can never access therapy. Fundamentally, there's two big enablers that happened over the past few years, which pretty much changes everything. The obvious one being AI. I have to go more in depth into that afterwards, like how we actually leverage AI and what we think this can really be an unlock for mental health. But I think there's also been a lot happening on the social side of things.
We are so excited to sit down with Chris today, the co-founder of Sonia, a trending mental health startup that was part of the Y Combinator Winter 24 batch. Chris and I met at MIT. He then went on to use his AI skills to solve important mental health problems, including making cognitive behavioral therapy accessible to everyone. Let's jump right in. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Chris, for being on the show today. We're so excited to have you to introduce Sonia, which you're diving into the world of mental health and cognitive behavioral therapy with AI. Very nice to have you here today.
Thanks for having me. Great chatting.
Right. So maybe, Chris, just introduce yourself and Sonia to our readers or listeners.
For sure, yeah. So I'm Chris, originally from Switzerland, grew up in Zurich, studied computer science at ETH. That's where I actually met my two co-founders, Dustin and Lucas. We then all came to the US to our grad school and studies at MIT. I did the master's in business analytics and data science at MIT, focused a lot on AI there, had a few more stops, spent some time in the Bay Area at Verkada, just hacking around on all sorts of ideas, trying to see how to build a company, learn from the founders there. Then we started Sonia last summer when Dustin and Lucas were finishing their work on AI research at CSAIL. And since then, I have been working on Sonia. And Sonia is an AI therapist that conducts entire text and voice-based therapy sessions via a phone app. So it's an iOS app live on the App Store. People can download it, have mental health care that is accessible anytime, anywhere, and for anyone really trying to bridge the gap between demand and supply in the mental health care industry.
Great. And how did you guys come up with the name Sonia, and why do you want to go into the mental health space, given what your background?
Sure. So for everything naming related, my co-founder Lucas is responsible. He's the creative name giver. I'm not very involved in the name process. I think Sonia, there's not a very long backstory. I mean, it'd be great if it would have been my ex-girlfriend who I've been traumatic about, and that's why I went to therapy, and that's how it all started. But there's no such story, unfortunately. It's easy to pronounce. It's a nice empathetic name. So that's the story background. And I think why mental health, several reasons. I think we all have our personal stories around why we think it's fundamentally something that is extremely important and also tragic in the way it is today. For myself, I just think fundamentally making people smile and being able to contribute to the happiness of people at scale is one of the most meaningful things you can do. I used to think that's much more like a charity, a philanthropy project for the second part of my life after I've built a company and startup.
Yeah.
So I used to think I'll probably build some B2B SaaS tool and get rich to sell that and build a charity. But I think obviously being able to perfectly align those two goals and incentives, and literally the way we build a company and the way we get large is by making people happy. And I think that's fundamentally something that keeps us very motivated, on our toes, and excited about what we're doing.
I remember when I met you first, it was last year when I was starting MIT and you were leaving MIT. At that time, I remember you were involved with a lot of things with blockchain, and you were I think the president with several clubs. But yeah, I was just curious about you seems to be interested in a lot of things. So for this startup project, you and your co-founder, is that more like you guys wanted to found a company and you're searching for the key problem you're trying to solve? Is that the way that you're approaching startup at this stage?
Somewhat. So for myself, it was always clear I wanted to build a company. That was the entire strategy and plan behind even coming to the US. I knew that would be a great jumping board for me to meet the right people and actually get into an environment where I can start a company. I think I knew Dustin and Lucas for a very long time, but with them, we specifically got together to build Sonia. It was an area that Lucas already had some prior research on. We talked a lot about it while they were still in school, and then we decided like that's the company we want to build. So that was really clear from day one. We didn't have first a long brainstorming session when we're like, oh, should we work in mental health, crypto, or in I don't know what, logistics. That was pretty set from day one there.
And also, I saw you had an official entrepreneur in residence experience listed there. Anything you insights you got from there, or like what did you work on? Maybe that's
Yeah,
related.
I mean, it's extremely unofficial. It was literally after I graduated, the time that she also referred to just now. After MIT, I knew I wanted to build a company. I didn't know exactly what it's going to be. And I thought a good strategy was to just be around successful founders. So the founders of Verkada, amazing CEO and chairman, they enabled me to just move out to their office and be around smart people while they teach me how to build a company. So I wasn't actually directly involved in their product itself, but I was able to just hang out there and like talk to the smartest people while I figure out what to build, what to iterate, build some random products, did some door-to-door sales, learned, got rejected, iterated, which was probably like potentially the most useful and valuable 6 to 8 months of my life. It's like having that fast feedback loop, exploring, figuring out what I really want to do, and just getting mentored from people who've achieved what I aspire to do.
Yeah, just going back a little bit on mental health, as we mentioned. Can you tell us a little bit about the current stage of mental health, and why CBT specifically you're targeting?
Yeah, so I mean, like even before technology enters the picture, I think the state of mental health today is that demand is ever rising. There's more and more people struggling with their mental health, specifically from anxiety and depression. By now, it's 20% of Americans every single year, whereby supply oftentimes being great, right? I think human therapists and top human therapists are one of the most precious and important things in the world, but supply is just very limited. And the state of mental health is really there being a huge gap between demand and supply. There's so many people who struggle with their mental health, but can never access therapy. And one of the big barriers really just being costs and wait list, right? Like if there's just not enough spots, like people need to wait several months. And once, I don't know what, September finally comes and I've paused my anxiety from now between September, I'll need to pay $200 per session, oftentimes out of pocket, because many therapists do not want to take reimbursements with insurance anymore. It's kind of like the industry has a lot of problems. And now moving more into technology, obviously it's not something new. People are trying to build mental health apps. I think fundamentally there's like two big enablers that happened over the past few years, which pretty much changes everything. The obvious one being AI. I have to go more in depth into that afterwards, like how we actually leverage AI and what we think this can really be an unlock for mental health. But I think there's also been a lot happening on the social side of things. Right? Like if we go back 10 years ago, you would have wanted to hide the fact that you go to therapy. If you would have told your peers, your friends at school that you're seeing a therapist, like people would have like potentially bullied you, which is like tragic, but like that's just how it was. And I know like specifically in Switzerland, that's like hugely stigmatized. People did not want to talk about mental health. But we're now at this time where it's like shifting in the opposite direction, like which I think is great, like A, just for humanity, but obviously also great to build a consumer app in the space is that people are proud to go to a therapist. It's almost like something good because it shows you take care of yourself, you take care of your psychology, you care about like being productive, being happy. So like it's really two unlocks that I think are a big opportunity here.
I remember trying one of the apps actually at MIT Media Lab around mental health space and helping with depression.
Yeah.
What makes Sonia stand out from the so many of the mental health assistant apps out there? Either it's being algorithm or user experience or something else.
Yeah, so I think there's two things that you want to get right when you build an AI therapist. And one of them I think is trivial, and one of them I think is extremely hard, right? You need to get your AI to talk like a therapist, which you can already achieve by just writing a single system prompt and like using some text to speech and speech to text models and having voice output very quickly. But I think what is hard is actually the part that is being abstracted away to the user. Like, how do you actually reason and think like a therapist? Because if you forget technology for a second and like actually think about like how a therapist conducts a therapy session, they need to have so much context and state awareness as they go through a 30 or 45-minute conversation. And it's only like the actual saying a sentence is such a small part of it, but they need to know like, oh, who's my patient? What have been my previous interactions with that patient? Where within the current session are we, right? Because like the start of a CBT session is fundamentally different than the end or the middle of it. So like having that state awareness of where you currently are, and then like based on where you are, and you're like, okay, so what's the current objective? What's the current goal? Given that this is the objective, what information do we need? What set of techniques and tools should we have access to? And like based on the last few messages, which ones are actually going to be relevant? So there's so much that happens. It's almost like the tip of the iceberg is just like talking like a therapist, but the hard part is really like that reasoning and planning, which I think is fundamentally much more of like an AI research challenge that it is a psychology challenge, because it's clear on what you need to do therapeutically, but it's very hard to like actually implement that psychologically.
I see. And just like going back to the tech stack of it, I'm just curious why you decide to build a mobile app versus a web app, which is quite common these days, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's just like going back to like how people want to interact with it. Right. I think like a common place where people do sessions with Sonia is like right before going to bed. Like, yeah, I have my laptop in my bed because I just like check emails here or something. But like many people, they're just like on their phone in bed before they like, turn off their laptop. It's like they might just use your laptop like for work or have it in another room. And right, what we really going back to want to solve is accessibility. And I think like your phone is just like a large enabler for accessibility. It's something you always have on you. And if you want to do a session, maybe in a short work break when you only have 5 minutes or before going to bed or wherever you are, we want to enable that.
You mentioned about teaching the AI to reason like a therapist is like an important task right there. And can you explain how you guys were able to do that? So is that more on the training data side, or is that more on the like a human kind of in the loop AI development?
It's so we don't have a human in the loop. There's a lot of humans in the loop while we figure out
Right.
how to build Sonia, right? Like we partner with therapists, we have advisors. It's like it's really figuring out like at what point in time should what be said. And like it's also you can think about early chatbots have been a decision tree of answers, right? Like that's how like chatbots have been built like 6, 7 years ago. And that's like even how the first AI therapists have been built. You just have like a decision tree of answers. And now it's kind of like shifting to what you now need to do is like build a very complex decision tree of situations and scenarios which impact what information you need, what retrieval you need to do. It's like the leaf of the decision tree is essentially the input to the AI model as opposed to the output of the AI. So it's like building a more and more nuanced tree and like case distinctions of like, oh yeah, so first case distinction is like, is this, I don't know, anxiety, or is this maybe depression? And then like, is it first session or is it your second session? Then like even within that session, or like what's the current topic? Is it talking about like troubles at school or troubles at relationships? So like based on doing all those case distinctions, you then have like a context. And on that context, you just need to do a lot of semantic reasoning, which is also LLM based, to prepare the information in a way that you can very easily use it to just generate a sentence, right? Because like the last step is only about turning context into a sentence. Like our final AI model doesn't have like a lot of tasks around like making decisions, because like also from like a security and security perspective, you shouldn't give it too much flexibility in ways that you can control. So it's like you get all the right context and then you turn that into a sentence. And maybe just the last thing, if that's at all interesting, is another big topic is the concept of retrieval, right? Like retrieval and all that RAG stuff being a huge thing in LLMs in general. But I think like a big insight here is that generic RAG with semantic search will just not work because it has either it has very bad signal to noise ratio, or alternatively, it doesn't make use of structure that you should make use of. Because in therapy, it sometimes is very clear that given that you precisely know what the context should be, you want to specifically retrieve that, right? Like if you're setting the main topic for today's session, which is like towards the beginning of a CBT session, you figure out in collaboration with the patient, what should you focus on today? But like in order to make that decision, you shouldn't just get summaries of previous sessions. You should precisely know what are topics that have been scratched on the surface in previous sessions, or what are things that the patient has mentioned on the site but has not gone into enough depth. So it's like it's almost a very domain specific structured retrieval process.
Yeah, and I think a big problem with the RAG is it assigns everything the same weight, so it doesn't really weight anything
Exactly.
like heavier.
Exactly.
Regarding the training data, as we didn't really touch much about, where were you guys training the data on? What data that you guys have? What would be the most important data, I would say? in here. Yeah.
Yeah, so we didn't start off by training our own models. We're now moving towards fine-tuning our models, but again, only fine-tuning the reasoning part. So we're actually not fine-tuning on transcripts, but we're fine-tuning on the data that Sonia generates to have all of that awareness. And for that, like, we're now in the process of labeling that data and working together with therapists to like actually know, it's almost like an RLHF sort of exercise that you know like what reasoning steps are helpful, which ones are not helpful, and then like training and fine-tuning the reasoning engine on those helpful steps.
So where did you guys get the resources to do all those training? Just curious.
Yeah, I mean, like, I guess there's two parts of that, right? A is the data, which is now built up over time from existing usage. We anonymize all data on their backend, but we also collect all data that we don't like share with third parties, but like in order to improve sessions, we use that data. And then like the other resources are more in the sense of compute, where we just like have a lot of deals either coming from YC or like other sources where we can get access to pretty cheap compute.
Right. In terms of the model and fine tuning, I'm just curious, like, so if you find like if you fine tune with the model, then you kind of need to stick with that model for a while to be economical, right? So how do you plan around these model succession that we see, a lot these days?
Yeah, I think the actual fine-tuning part itself will not be the most complicated. It'll be like preparing your data set that allows you to fine-tune it, right? And I think like that you can definitely
Right.
recycle.
Yeah.
Yeah. Diving a little bit into the user journey. So let's imagine I'm a new user going on to Sonia. Can you walk us through the user journey? I know there are two parts, so like a longer session versus a shorter session. Can you tell us a little bit about that too? Yeah.
For sure. Yeah, happy to go on all three of those topics. So first of all, we want to have the user experience with the onboarding as simple as possible for several reasons. Just A, because people hate complicated onboardings, and B, we want to make it very clear that we don't collect all sorts of information, right? So we don't even have like the concept of like a sophisticated login. You don't need to enter your last name. You can literally get started by just having a pseudonym or like a single letter as your name. You don't need to give your age and your email. It's optional fields. So like an app comes, gives you some information about what Sonia is, what she does, some sort of like information about privacy and security, then you can enter your name and you get started immediately. And so within like 30 seconds of having downloaded the app, you could already be inside of your first session, which you can also get fully started for free. On the second question that you asked, the different session types. So, right, like historically and the way it is in the real world, is that therapy sessions are usually somewhere between like 30 and 60 minutes, depending on like what type of therapy it is and what therapist. I think there's a lot of like variance there as well. So we started with a 30-minute conversation. And an interesting observation we actually had is that sometimes people used Sonia with something very specific that came up and needed like immediate attention. So funny enough, like almost the same way you would call your partner or friend or family member after a tough meeting or like a bad day, or say you just had an unsuccessful pitch for startup, whatever, like also like vent for a few minutes, like get some sort of acknowledgement, and when you, maybe like one or two practical pieces of advice. And we've seen many people try to use Sonia and her longer sessions in that way, but that was obviously hard to do because like we built entire product to have a 30-minute conversation, which also like has that awareness of not just jumping ahead too quickly. So like the first like 5 to 10 minutes are just about like getting more information or getting an update. So we then added those shorter 5-minute sessions kind of as like an emotional release in augmentation to longer form sessions that you can potentially use like during the day or throughout the week. And actually we've seen pretty interesting patterns around how people are now using that. For example, throughout the day, short sessions spike at around like 10 to 11 a.m. So like when people are at work or they are at school and they might have a short break, whereby longer therapy sessions, they spike at 6 p.m. or 11 p.m. And then also throughout the week, we have more therapy sessions on the weekends and then more shorter sessions throughout the week, which kind of like correlates nicely with how much time people really have.
No, just like interesting stuff around how the user behavior like evolves and around the product. I'm just curious, what's the most loved feature so far? What's the thing that you see people maybe said to you guys like I like this a lot, or just some ratings?
Yeah, for sure. There's several aspects there. I think one thing that's just extremely important is voice, right? I think that there's like several tools that just only offer text option, and based on the direct feedback we get from users, but also like the patterns we see behind usage, voice leads to way higher retention than text. That's a big one. And another thing that users usually comment on being very positive, and we also like see again is correlated with retention, is we have interactive elements. So we have like worksheets, or we have visualizations and metaphors that come up throughout the sessions, and people really like those. So everything that elevates it from purely like a chat experience to at least having like audio, and even more so like interactive elements that you can like actually play around with and have on the app, like the more of that exists, the more people really enjoy it.
Yeah, regarding the interactive elements, is that within the session or between sessions?
Yeah, it's within the session directly. So like, for
Um,
example, you have a hard time articulating your thoughts or your values, which is like an important part of therapy, then like Sonia notices that and suggests you to fill out like a value clarification worksheet, which then like just like visually appears on the user interface. You fill that out, and obviously that information is then more signal again to continue the sessions and understand the patient better.
yeah. So does Sonia also look into between session interactions?
We have, for in between sessions right now, we generate like therapy notes, and homeworks is a big part of CPT as well that people can go back and look into. We're actually expanding that right now. That's what we're currently working on and building. We also have a mood tracking feature where people can track their mood, check it occasionally, again, information that is valuable for like seeing and figuring out like how the patient has been doing in between sessions. But right now, like it's mainly around the actual therapy sessions themselves. That's like our main focus. We don't want to get too distracted by just like adding one feature after another and like just see how that works. But it's actually maybe just one thing to add there. It's an interesting and occasionally challenging balance to maximize therapeutical effectiveness and user engagement, right? Because there's been many apps in the past which started potentially like a relatively similar route, but then like in order to get like retention super high and usage super high, you want to have people addicted to your app, right? I think that's what a lot of like mobile apps are based off. And in order to get like addicted to an app like that, you need to turn it more into like an AI girlfriend or an AI boyfriend, and like have that engaging and like more of that. But like that's just like very clearly what we're not trying to get into. And I think you can have engagement without needing to pivot away from or like sacrificing on the front of being therapeutically effective. So with every feature that we want to launch, you want to be super careful of, does it actually both lead to engagement, but also make sense from a therapeutical standpoint? Like, do we actually believe people can feel better because that feature exists? And how much should they use that feature? There's also cases where we have patients who've done way too many therapy sessions, where somebody has done like 10 or 20 entire therapy sessions within a few days, which is definitely not therapeutically effective. So now we also need to start regulating the upper bound you can do, which is like counterintuitive to probably most apps, which is just like, oh wow, those are our top users, we love them. But we want to do like everything from the perspective of like our end goal is just like helping those people be happier, and doing 10 therapy sessions in 2 days is probably not going to help you feel better.
Yeah. Curious about drop off, let's say, because when we go into actual person therapist sessions, you cannot really drop off, right? The person is right there. You cannot just like bye, leave after 10 minutes. But in an app, maybe someone don't have the obligation of I have to be here. So like let's say after 15 minutes, they would just leave. Do you see that happening?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely happens. And it's a great point that you mentioned, because I think most people are only aware of entry barriers being lower for what we do, but which is great and it's true, but exit barriers are also significantly lower, right? It's much easier to just like swipe up and close the app as it is to like storm out of your therapist's office and like drive home. Like the accountability you have inherently to a physical therapy session is way higher. So it's a mix between like trying to replicate that accountability to some extent, which I think comes a lot with user education, like making them aware that 30 minutes are really important to be completed, that is only effective if you actually go through the entire process. Also making sure that people only start sessions when they really have 30 minutes, right? Because like sometimes people would start a session knowing that they're like after 5 minutes they need to leave, which is like somewhat pointless. But also what we're doing, and could launch in the next like 1 or 2 weeks, is the ability to just pause sessions. It's like if you actually don't, like something comes up, which can naturally happen, right? 30 minutes is a long time. You can pause the session and continue next time without like having to start from the beginning again for losing that information.
Yeah.
Right. You mentioned before about having people, I guess, sort of addicted to the app, or like, I'm just curious, how have you guys been growing, whether through organic growth, word of mouth, or partnership with others? What sort of marketing plans are you doing or planning to do?
Yeah, so we did all pretty organic so far. So we haven't done like any paid online advertising. We were very much focused on student demographics so far. So we built a student ambassador program and had 22 students throughout the semester helping us spread the word on campuses, partner with organization, host events, just spread the word around there, post flyers, tell our friends about it. Like that has given us very good growth. Social media, we're also playing around with. We have TikTok channel now that we're getting some posts from. Instagram. Also, Reddit has been a very good acquisition channel for us, right? Like Reddit is, of course, very targeted. There's extremely large anxiety and depression subreddits. Sometimes it's more manual in the sense of like you don't get like hundreds of users, but you get like very high quality users and people who like very directly click with using a service like that. As you scale it up, I think you can become a lot more repeatable and less manual, but I actually think it's very helpful to in early days not just like put on some Google ads and like burn through your VC money, but like really understand like where users come from and while still maintaining like relatively good growth, which is important.
Right. Yeah. On the point about Google Ads, I just Google some stuff around, and I see maybe 10 sponsored ads out there,
Yeah.
like all the similar products. Like, this is crazy.
Yeah, like it just won't help you anything, right? Because like until you have a great product, you just like you pay and your lifetime value is just like extremely low.
And going forward, is there like another channel, for example, like a 2B? Because for example, Lara, another therapist app or a service, I think they are a web app, but they kind of dive exclusive into 2B side, partnering with companies. Do you think about that's another route for you guys?
Yeah, it's definitely another route, and we're talking to some players about like potential partnerships there. So it's like it's actively being looked at, but nothing too publicly yet.
Yeah, good. Yeah, so that's a great segue into your plan for Sonia in the next 5 years.
Yeah,
we can talk about 1 year and then 5 year. Yeah.
sure. It's kind of a spectrum, right? I think fundamentally what we want to do is make Sonia accessible to everyone who struggles with their mental health, which I think is like already a pretty ambitious project. And while doing that, it's obviously a distribution challenge, but it's also another spectrum, which is like increasingly making Sonia better. The way we look at Sonia is almost like a very junior therapist, and we want to get her to be a very, very, very senior therapist. The same way a therapist over the course of their lifetime gathers and learns new skills, new techniques, more worksheets, more case distinctions on like what types of patients they're treating. Like that's what we want to achieve with Sonia, which is like fundamentally making a product better. I think at the end of the day, really, it's key to build a great therapist, right? That's the unlock to everything here. Once you have a very good therapist, I think go to market in this case is easier than for other cases because the value proposition is so clear. If you can prove this is equally effective as a top human therapist, but 100 times cheaper, I think it's like a pretty strong sales pitch. But you first need to make sure the product is actually as good as the top human therapist, then prove that with clinical trials, with working together with great research organizations. It's like a big focus will just be gradually making Sonia better, which I also don't think is a step function. There's obviously like some bumps and some like plateaus again, but it's about like continuously just getting feedback, working with therapists, getting therapists on board and making her capabilities expand. That's I think like that'll probably like take more than just like the next year, but like that's definitely our current focus. I think like going more into the long-term future, it's once you have the point achieved almost where everybody who wants to see a therapist can see Sonia. I think we're simultaneously also evolving into a direction where mental health is becoming something more proactive than just reactive. But I think it's a trend that physical health has already gone through, that like people go to the gym although they're not sick and although their leg is not broken. And the same way, I just fundamentally believe people should take care of their mental health, not only after they felt extremely anxious or not only when they're going through a depressive phase. And like moving into that direction, I think we definitely want to be a big part of it as well.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended as financial or investment advice. We do not guarantee the accuracy, completeness, or timeliness of the information presented. This podcast is not an offer or solicitation for the purchase or sale of any financial instrument. Thank you for subscribing and see you again soon.